240. The standard name is the auditor's responsibilities relating to fraud in an audit of financial statement. I hope you can see this screen. The standard is given in the screen. Students, can you see this standard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In the standard basically covers scope of this SLAUS, characteristics of fraud, responsibility for the prevention and detection of fraud, objectives, definitions, requirements. Under requirements, there are several requirements according to the standard. One is professional skepticism. Second one is discussion among the engagement team. Third requirement is risk assessment procedures and related activities. Fourth one is identification and assessment of risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Next one, responses to the assessed risk and material misstatement due to fraud. Evaluation of evidence. Auditors unable to continue the engagement. Written representation. Communication to the management with those management and with those charged with governance. Communications to regulatory and enforcement authorities. Documentation. These are the requirements. We have no time to discuss each and everything, right? So we will important area only we will discuss, right? These are the requirements, means auditors under this standard, what auditors to be carried out. This professional skepticism should be used. Discussion with the engagement team to be carried out. How to do this, everything is given in the standard. Risk assessment procedure relating to the fraud, how to do this, explained here. Identification and assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to fraud, how to do this, everything is given. Evaluation of audit evidence. Auditors unable to continue the engagement, one of the current appluang. Written representation, to whom communicate. If there is a fraud, to whom communicate? First is communication to the management and with those charged with governance. Communication not only the management, regulatory and enforcement authorities. That is, if it is a serious, police or any other parties and other enforcement authorities, users of the financial statement, documentation. All these are given in the standard, but I restricted the discussion. Only we are concerning important matters, right? The explanation of the notes also there. Fraud risk matters is given. The example appendix, fraud risk factors, example of possible audit procedures to address the assessed risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Example of circumstances that indicate the possibility of fraud. That is, several examples are there. So you must, one or two, you must see this. Right. First, characteristics of fraud. To understand what we understand the earlier slides, based on this, you try to understand the characteristics of fraud. Misstatements in the financial statements can arise from either fraud or error. Misstatement arise either fraud or error. So, two ways misstatements can be included in the financial statement. One way is a fraud. One way of misstatement through the fraud. One way of misstatements through the error. The distinguishing factor between fraud and error is whether the underlying action that results in the misstatement of the financial statement is intentional or unintentional. What we discussed earlier, fraud is an intentional act. Error is an unintentional act. So, underlying action that result in the financial statement of the misstatement is intentional or unintentional. So, you must know what are the difference between fraud or error. All the errors are not fraud. All the frauds are not error. So you are an auditor. When you are an auditor, you must have a knowledge to identify whether this misstatement is fraud or error. The distinguished factor is the intentional or unintentional. Depending on that, we can categorize whether it is fraud or error. Right. Then, according to the standard, auditors are concerned two types of intentional misstatements relevant to the auditor. The examiner asks, what are the two types of intentional misstatements are relevant to the auditor? One is two types of intentional misstatements relevant to the auditor. One is misstatement resulting from fraudulent financial statement. One misstatement is fraudulent financial statement. Misstatement resulting from misstatement, other misstatement is misappropriation of assets. I hope you can understand, right? First I explain what is the characteristics of misstatement, fraud or error. Second, we are going to discuss in detail two types of misstatements. One is misstatement resulting from fraudulent financial mistake. Misstatement, fraudulent financial mistake. Other category is misstatement resulting from misappropriation of assets. So, misstatements, one is fraudulent financial reporting, other one is misappropriation of assets. So, we are going to discuss in detail this one. This is explained A2, A3 and A4. This is explained A5. How misappropriation is asset is accomplished. How the fraudulent financial statement. How fraudulent financial statement may be carried out. We will discuss. Right. So that is a second one. Third matter is we are going to discuss is responsibility for the prevention and detection of fraud. That is whose responsibility? Can any students can answer this based on my earlier explanation? Who is responsible for the prevention and detection of fraud? Any student? Please answer. Whose responsibility? So, auditor? I need your feedback. I don't know whether you are in the class or somewhere. You must answer this. I am repeating. Who is responsible? Who is responsible for the prevention and detection of fraud? You should answer that. Students? very difficult to take class online. That is a problem. Without your feedback, it is difficult to continue the lecture program. I already explained who is responsible, whether auditor or management. Who is responsible for the prevention and detection of fraud? Students? Very good. One students, right, 2%. Thank you very much for your response. Com 11 and MS 22, I am appreciating for your response. Thank you very much. So according to them, the management is responsible, right? We'll see the primary responsibility for the prevention and detection of fraud restrict both those charged with governance of the entity. Those charged means governing body. If it is a university, governing body is a council. If it is a company, governing body is a board of directors, right? The responsibilities both. One is those charged with governance of the entity and management. Both parties are responsible for the prevention of and detection of fraud, not auditors. It is important that management with the oversight of those charged with governance place a strong emphasis on fraud prevention. Strong emphasis on fraud prevention, which may reduce opportunity for fraud to take place. And fraud deterrences, deterrence means reduce, which could persuade individual not to commit fraud because of the likelihood of detention and punishment. This involves commitment to creating a culture of honesty and ethical behavior, which can be reinforced by an active oversight by those charged with governance. Oversight by those charged with governance include considering potential for overriding controls, such as efforts by management to manage earning in order to influence the perceptions of the analysis as to the entity's performance and profitability. So, management or those charged with governance can have some tools to prevent or detection of the fraud, right? There are a lot of mechanism can be adopted by the management, right? Not to individual, not to commit fraud, right? One is punishment, right? Another one is culture of honesty and ethical behavior. That is strict control system. And potential, there are control systems. Sometimes override this control management with this influence. So there are management earning in order to influence the perceptions of the analysis. So there are lot of mechanism. This is called preventing tools. Segregation of duty also preventing tools. Supervision, oversighting, controls. Lot of controls. Control that software controls, right? Cameras, fixing cameras. All these control systems should be adapted by the management, right? To overcome this fraud or error. So this paragraph is deal with the responsibility. The responsibility of the auditor. The first we studied responsibility. The examiner asked, briefly discuss the responsibility of fraud in an audit of finance statement, you can't give only the management responsibility, right? You must, both responsibility you must describe. But we describe the management responsibility, I explained earlier paragraph. Here, what we are explained here is the auditor's responsibility. Sometimes directly ask, but briefly discuss management responsibility with regard to the prevention and detection of fraud. You can say only the management responsibility. But generally ask, you must state both management and auditor's responsibility. Sometimes specifically ask what are the auditor responsibility of auditor relating to the detection and prevention of fraud. So all these responsibilities you should know. The auditor conducting an audit in accordance with Sri Lanka auditing standard is responsible for obtaining reasonable assurance that the financial statement taken as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether caused by fraud or error. So this is the auditor's responsibility. Not stated directly, auditors is not responsible, not stated here. Auditor's responsibility to follow Sri Lanka auditing standard and obtaining reasonable assurance whether the financial statements are free from material misstatements due to fraud or error. That's all. Owing to the inherent limitation of an audit, there is an unavoidable risk that some material misstatements of the financial statements may not be detected even though audit is properly planned and performed in accordance with the Sri Lanka auditing standard. Even though audit is carried following auditing standard, there is a risk of material misstatement. Undetected misstatement is possible, but auditors are not responsible. Auditors why? That is a reasonable assurance. Auditors is responsible to carry out audit in accordance with Sri Lanka auditing standard. Understand? So auditors are not directly responsible, right? So other responsibilities are there, right? Only you can read it and understand. Only the auditor is responsible where there's a doubt or suspicion to fraud. You should go top to the bottom. Unless otherwise, you need not carry out. You need not responsible to detect each and every fraud or error, right? So according to the court case, the Kingston Cotton Mills, other Robinson cases, it was decided, it was held that the auditors, if it is a suspicion arose in the transaction, he should go top to the bottom. Unless otherwise, auditors are not responsible to detect each and every fraud or error, right? So you must clearly understand what is auditor's responsibility with regard to detection and prevention of fraud. What are the management responsibilities with regard to detection of fraud and error? Now we'll come to the objective of the standard. According to there are objective of the standard. Objective of the standard. There are three objectives of the standard. One is objective of the auditor are to identify and assess the risk of material misstatement of the financial statement due to fraud. According to the objective of the auditor, identify and assess the risk of material misstatement. Risk of material misstatement he should assess. So he should do the risk assessment, right? Risk assessment. Identify the risk, and assess the risk of material misstatement of the financial statement due to fraud. That is the first objective of the auditor. Second objective, to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding the assessed risk of material misstatement due to fraud through designing and implementing appropriate responses. Through designing and implementing appropriate responses. Based on the response, right, he should obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding the assessed risk of material mistake due to fraud. Right? That is the second objective of the auditor. Third objective, to respond appropriately of the fraud or suspected fraud identified during the audit. There are three responsibilities, three objectives of the auditor. Is identify and assess the risk assessment. Second one, sufficient appropriate audit evidence to assess the risk, material misstatement due to fraud or error. Third, to respond appropriately of fraud. You must respond or suspected fraud identified during the audit. You can't simply eliminate, right? If there are any risks related to the fraud, you must appropriately respond. These are the three objectives of the auditor, according to the standard. Right. Now we'll see the definition, two definition only. This is always testing, all exams. Fraud, Banchava, Mosadi. Mosadi and Banchava, defined. According to the standard, an intentional act. Intentional and purposely. Intentional act by one or more individual among management. So within the management. Those charged with governance. Governance means members of the board or members of the council also is possible, right? Among management or those charged with governance. Third one, employees or third parties involving the use of deception to obtain an unjust or illegal advance. Use of deception, involving the use of deception, right, to obtain unjust or illegal advance. There are three categories, four matters to be included in the definition. One is intentional act. By whom? Among the individual, among management, those charged with governance or employees or third parties. Second matters. Third one, use of deception to obtain injustice or illegal advantage. If it is proof there is no illegal or injustice advantages, that is no fraud. If they have proof there is no use of deception, right, there is no fraud. If they prove there is no intentional act, it is unintentional, it is not a fraud. So you must clearly understand the definition of fraud as per standard. Second one, fraud risk factors. There are factors we already discussed, but you don't know how to define these factors. Fraud risk factors, event or conditions that indicate an incentive or pressure to commit fraud. Incentive or pressure to commit fraud or provide an opportunity to commit fraud. That is called fraud risk factor, right? For example, events or conditions that indicate an incentive or pressure to commit fraud or provide an opportunity to commit fraud. Some rules are violated. So bank reconciliation not prepared in time. That is a fraud risk factor. Understand that the duties are not segregated. That is events or conditions that indicate incentive pressure to commit fraud or provide opportunity to commit fraud. There are so many fraud indicators, right? That is called, those factors are called fraud risk factors. Fraud risk factors. Reconciliation not done, right? The tender procedures violated. The delegation of authority is not given. Duties are not segregated, right? Daily bank collection not deposited in time. These are the fraud risk factors, right? The officers are not rotated, right? The officers are long period tenure, right? These are the fraud risk factors. So many factors, right? There is no supervision, no monitoring, right? No delegations. All these are fraud risk factors. If you in the standard, you can see the several factors under several categories called fraud risk factors. Here you try to understand what is fraud risk factor. Event or condition that indicate an incentive or pressure to commit fraud, to provide an opportunity to commit fraud. That is called fraud risk factor. According to the standard, right? According to the standard, there are some requirements, right? We are not going to discuss, right? We are not going to discuss. I will give you the headings only, right? According to this, the auditor should use this professional skepticism. If when there is a fraud, the professional skepticism පාවිච්චි කරන්න ඕන. මේක professional that is explained here, the paragraph 12 and paragraph A7 to A8, right? I am not explaining further, right? The one requirement is professional skepticism, right? The second requirements, according to the standard, discuss among the engagement team, right? If there is a fraud, right, according to the standard, discussion among the engagement team members and engagement partner and communication should be take place among the all members, right? Discussion among the engagement team. That is a second requirement. Third requirements is a risk assessment procedures and related activities, right? Based on the SLAG 315, risk should be assessed. That is a third requirements, right? Fourth requirements is identification and assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. The third is risk assessment. Fourth one is identification and assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. That is fourth one. Fourth requirements. Fifth one, respond to assess risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Fifth requirements. Sixth requirements. Evaluation of audit evidence. So when you evaluate the